In the heart of a remote village in Colombia, surrounded by dense forests and shrouded in a constant veil of mist, an event occurred that still chills its inhabitants. Diana, the young woman with a radiant smile and a generous spirit, was known by everyone in the community. Her sudden death, caused by a rare and fatal heart condition, plunged the village into deep sorrow. The church bells rang with sadness the day of her funeral, and a silent crowd gathered to bid her farewell, convinced that her soul had already found peace. However, that very night, the village ceased to be a refuge of calm. From the depths of the cemetery, just past midnight, came heart-wrenching moans that froze the blood of those living nearby. The cries were not the natural sounds of the wind or the creaking of branches. They were human wails, agonizing and desperate, emanating from the freshly sealed grave of Diana. For 2 days and 2 nights, the screams continued, driving the neighbors mad as they gathered in the streets, too afraid to cross the cemetery gates but unable to ignore what was happening. Finally, Diana's family, driven by fear and desperation, sought permission from the priest and the mayor to open the grave. The request was granted, and before an expectant crowd, the tombstone was removed and the coffin exposed. The lid creaked as it was lifted, and a thick silence fell over the place. Inside the coffin, Diana lay untouched, her skin still fresh, but with an expression that sent chills through everyone. Her eyes, wide and fixed, held an infinite anguish. Before the witnesses could react, a muffled groan escaped from her lips, and her trembling hands slowly rose. Panic swept through the crowd. Screams and sobs filled the air as some ran in terror while others stood hypnotized, watching as Diana, with slow, brittle movements, began to sit up. Her legs faltered beneath her, but something in her gaze seemed to demand more than help. Those who tried to approach recoiled, feeling an inhuman cold emanating from her body. Her family, torn between fear and hope, surrounded her, unsure of what to do or think. In the days that followed, Diana's behavior grew increasingly disturbing. She no longer recognized anyone, not even her parents or friends. Her eyes, shadowed by unknown darkness, seemed to see beyond this world. She spoke in a raspy voice about gray landscapes and figures that crawled in silence. She described how, from that place, she had witnessed her own burial, surrounded by shadows that whispered her name. Every word that left her lips struck the hearts of her listeners, and the sense that something unnatural had brought her back grew stronger. "Death is only the beginning," she murmured incessantly. Her stories grew darker as she began to describe a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes who had been watching her from the depths of that shadowy world. The figure, she claimed, had followed her across the divide and now whispered from the shadows of her room at night. The entire village began to change. Animals fled in fear, and plants in the gardens near Diana's house withered for no apparent reason. The children, who once played freely in the streets, no longer dared pass by her house, where candles seemed to go out without wind and the windows vibrated with inaudible whispers. Her family, on the brink of despair, consulted the priest, but even he, after visiting Diana, left pale and mute, as though his faith had been stripped by what he had seen. One night, the tension reached a breaking point in an event that would be forever etched in the collective memory. Diana vanished from the house without a trace. The search, led by her parents and friends, took them once again to the cemetery, where some claimed to have seen a pale figure wandering between the tombstones. When they arrived, The full moon illuminated a sight they would never forget. In her former grave, Diana's body lay, now showing obvious signs of decomposition. Her skin, which had been intact only days before, was now dry and cracked, her eyes empty, and her mouth twisted into an impossible smile. Horror and disbelief seized everyone. No one could explain how the body had returned to its resting place or why it had begun to rot so rapidly. An old man from the village, known for his tales of ancient legends, whispered with a trembling voice, "What returns from death is not always what it was. Sometimes it brings something with it." By morning, the rumors had intensified. Some swore they had seen Diana walking through the village, leaving no trace or shadow, while others claimed to hear the same mournful moan that had escaped her grave on that fateful night. The terrified inhabitants began boarding up their windows and avoiding the cemetery at all costs. No one spoke openly about the matter, but everyone knew that Diana's death, or rather her return, was an omen of something far more sinister. Weeks later, the case was deemed an unsolved mystery. Visits to the cemetery dwindled, and Diana's house was abandoned, a silent reminder of a horror that defied all understanding. Nights in the village grew restless again, and every breeze that passed through the streets carried with it a distant echo, a whisper that said, "Death is only the beginning." To this day, the villagers shudder when they remember. The scars of that event still pulse beneath the surface, a reminder that there are things that should not return from where they belong, and that in the fine line between life and death, there are secrets that should remain buried forever. In the depths of the Colombian Amazon jungle, where the humidity soaks every corner and the darkness seems eternal, there lies a small indigenous village. Its inhabitants, descendants of an ancient civilization, carefully guard their traditions and legends, many of which are tied to supernatural forces and dark entities. Among them is the story of Anahi, a young shaman who had been chosen to lead her tribe toward a prosperous future. Anahi was known for her wisdom and her deep connection to the spirit of the jungle. However, during an ancestral ritual, something went terribly wrong. In an attempt to summon a protective ancestral spirit, Anahi accidentally opened a door to a dark and unknown realm. A malevolent force seized her, corrupting both her body and soul. Days later, Anahi died under strange circumstances. Her body, once radiating vitality, had become cold and rigid as stone, and her eyes, once full of wisdom, were now empty and glassy. The tribe's shamans tried to perform a purification ritual, but nothing could break the curse that bound her to that dark entity. On the night of her burial, the village descended into chaos. Heart-wrenching screams echoed from the cemetery, where Anahi had been laid to rest. Terrified villagers claimed to see a spectral figure emerging from the grave, a figure that seemed to be Anahi, but with eyes that burned like embers and a macabre smile revealing sharp teeth. As the days passed, the attacks grew more frequent. Crops withered, animals died mysteriously, and villagers began to disappear without a trace. Some claimed to have seen Anahi roaming the jungle, accompanied by sinister shadows. Desperate, the shamans tried to contact the ancestral spirits for help, but they either remained indifferent or were filled with fear. The legend tells that Anahi had become a muina, an evil spirit that feeds on the fear and suffering of the living. It was said that the Muina could possess humans, turning them into its slaves, and thus spreading its dark realm. On the brink of despair, the villagers decided to take a desperate measure: to burn Anahi's body. They believed this would destroy the Muina that inhabited her. With great sorrow, they carried her body into a jungle clearing and surrounded it with firewood. As the flames consumed Anahi's body, the shamans chanted ancient songs to protect the village. However, when the flames died down and the ashes were scattered by the wind, the villagers realized they had made a mistake. The Muina had not been destroyed. On the contrary, it seemed to have multiplied, spreading its influence throughout the jungle. Anahi's screams could be heard from every corner, and the shadows moved with greater speed and ferocity. The villagers, realizing they could not defeat the Muina on their own, decided to abandon their home and seek refuge in other lands. But they knew that the evil they had unleashed would chase them to the end of their days. In the remote village of San Lorenzo, nestled between snow-capped mountains and shadowy forests, there is an ancient legend about a forgotten cemetery where the darkest of sinners lie buried. It is said that on nights of the full moon, a forbidden ritual can resurrect the dead, but at a terrible cost. Their souls will be corrupted by a malevolent force. Don Anselmo, an elderly hermit known for his wisdom and dark knowledge, had studied ancient grimoires for years that spoke of this ritual. Obsessive about the power it would grant him, he decided to perform the ceremony on the darkest night of the year. In the cemetery, beneath the pale light of the moon, Don Anselmo drew a magical circle around a freshly dug grave. With a hoarse voice and bloodshot eyes, he recited the forbidden words, summoning the forces of darkness. The earth trembled, the wind howled, and an icy cold enveloped the place. Suddenly, the coffin burst open, and a twisted, emaciated figure emerged. It was the body of his deceased wife, but her eyes burned with an infernal fire, and her mouth twisted into a macabre smile, revealing sharp teeth. At first, Don Anselmo felt elated. He had done what no one else had dared. But soon he realized his terrible mistake. His wife, now possessed by a dark force, turned against him. With supernatural strength, she knocked him down and began biting him frantically, transferring the curse to him. The next day, the people of San Lorenzo found Don Anselmo's mangled body, and his wife was wandering the cemetery, her eyes hollow and with an insatiable thirst for blood. Terror gripped the village. The elders warned that a malignant force had been unleashed, and that only the unity of the people could stop it. They decided to perform a collective exorcism. But the force that possessed the woman was too powerful. No prayer or blessing seemed to have any effect. The curse spread quickly, turning more people into bloodthirsty monsters. The village became a battlefield. The infected, with glowing eyes and spasmodic movements, attacked anyone who crossed their path. The few survivors sought refuge in the church, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the monsters found them. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a hooded figure watched with a malevolent smile, pleased with the chaos he had set into motion. He was an ancient enemy of Don Anselmo, a necromancer who had been waiting for the right moment to seek revenge. He had manipulated the old man, guiding him toward the performance of the forbidden ritual, all to unleash chaos and plunge the world into darkness. The necromancer, with his arcane power, managed to control the infected, turning them into his army. His plan was simple: to free the dead across the world and plunge humanity into an age of eternal darkness. The survivors of San Lorenzo, desperate, sought help from an ancient monastery. There, an old monk, familiar with the church's darkest secrets, revealed the only way to stop the necromancer: destroy the grimoire containing the forbidden ritual. A small band of brave souls ventured out into the night to steal the grimoire. They knew it was a suicidal mission, but they were willing to sacrifice themselves to save humanity. After a dangerous journey, they infiltrated the necromancer's castle and stole the book. With the grimoire in their hands, the heroes returned to San Lorenzo and destroyed it in a purifying bonfire. At the same time, the survivors, led by the monk, launched a final assault against the army of the dead. The battle was fierce. The infected fought with supernatural strength, but the living defended themselves with tooth and nail. Finally, thanks to a heroic sacrifice, they managed to defeat the necromancer and his creatures. With the necromancer's death, the curse began to fade. The infected reverted to their human forms, though forever scarred by psychological wounds. The village of San Lorenzo, though suffering irreparable losses, had survived. However, the threat never fully disappeared. It is said that on the darkest nights, when the full moon illuminates the cemeteries, the dead still whisper their names, longing to return to life. And the necromancer, though defeated, may one day return, bringing with him new nightmares and horrors.